Good morning, friends, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Meli Caballero Anthony. I am the head of the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies here at RSIS. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the RSIS World Humanitarian Day 2022 webinar, Anticipatory Action in Humanitarian Responses, Local Perspectives. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us in this event. The World Humanitarian Day is a particularly special day. It marks the anniversary of the 203 bombing of the UN headquarters in Baghdad, Iraq, when 22 humanitarian workers were killed. Ever since, the date is an opportunity to pay respect to all humanitarian workers around the world, as well as to strengthen the understanding of and respect for international humanitarian law. Every day, humanitarian aid workers help millions of people around the world, regardless of who they are and where they are. Such efforts cannot go unrecognized by the rest of the international community. This year's World Humanitarian Day theme is "It Takes a Village." The theme promotes the idea of collective endeavor to grow global appreciation of humanitarian work. It shines a light on the thousands of volunteers, professionals, and crisis-affected people who deliver urgent healthcare, shelter, food protection, water, and much more. In line with this, the annual RSIS event to commemorate World Humanitarian Day brings together local players in the humanitarian sphere to celebrate the dedication of humanitarian workers around the world and to remember those in most need of assistance. It aims to raise public awareness on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in the region by providing a venue for exchange of ideas, insights, and experiences from practitioners based in Singapore. There have been recent developments at the global and regional level to indicate a push towards more proactive humanitarian responses and interventions. In fact, in June this year, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, released the ASEAN Framework of Anticipatory Action in Disaster Management. Anticipatory action is a set of interventions by an individual or organization before an anticipated disaster based on a forecast, an early warning, or pre-disaster risk analysis to mitigate its impact on people, on assets and infrastructure that are likely to be affected. This can take the form of distribution of cash or in-kind items or specific actions such as strengthening shelters or evacuating assets and people before the disaster occurs. Today's webinar, therefore, will generate discussion on the following areas. First, a reflection from COVID-19 on how organizations have incorporated anticipatory action into their operations and responses, and the ways to scale up anticipatory action efforts in the future. We are very lucky and pleased to have with us today 3 distinguished speakers, which will be introduced in a while, all who have significant experience in humanitarian work. I look forward to the sharing of personal experiences from the field as we continue these efforts to acknowledge and embrace the complex challenges faced by humanitarian workers and, moreover, salute the excellent work that they do to provide assistance to those who need it most. Thank you very much, and we look forward to a lively discussion. Over to our moderator, my colleague, Dr. Alexander Cook. Al.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So what I would like to do first is to introduce the speakers in the order in which they will reflect with us on the local responses to anticipatory action in humanitarian response. So first we'll hear from Costa, Konstantinos Antonopoulos, who has been an active player in the humanitarian sphere for more than 15 years. And at present, he is the regional representative to ASEAN for MSF, Doctors Without Borders. And prior to this, he has served in a number of other roles, including MSF in the UK as a policy and advocacy advisor. And he began his career within the Greek Foreign Service. Within the region, he's worked specifically in Singapore, Malaysia, Myanmar, Indonesia, PNG, Papua New Guinea, and Thailand, as well as Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Yemen in our near neighborhood. So we look forward to hearing his reflections on anticipatory action and how that works in the field. Our second speaker is Matilda Leong, who works for World Vision International, one of the world's largest humanitarian organizations, specifically working with children, families, and communities. And she's focused her work on microfinance, as well as fundraising in the region. She has experience both in humanitarian work, development work, as well as impact investing. And her experience spans Asia, Africa, and the Middle East over the last 10 years, and has been involved in a number of different functions in humanitarian work, from program and business development, monitoring and evaluation, as well as research. And our third speaker is Angelina Ong, who is currently the Executive Director of Mercy Relief, Singapore's leading independent disaster relief agency. And she has extensive experience in the non-profit sector, as well as a general manager at the Breast Cancer Foundation in Singapore. She has been involved in a number of awareness and education activities, support and volunteer programs, fundraising, media, finance, and administration. So I think we will hear from the three speakers, who will have a number of important observations and reflections to share with us on local responses to humanitarian crises, and also the role of anticipatory action, and also to share some of their reflections over their experience over the last few years during the COVID-19 pandemic. So without further ado, Costa, it's over to you. You've 15 minutes, and I'll chime in if you run over that, but otherwise the floor is yours. Costa?
Yes, thank you very much, Alistair. Thank you, Melly. And as I'm trying to log in and share my presentation, let me thank the whole team at RSIS for inviting me and inviting MSF and giving us the opportunity to be here. And let me extend my thanks to all participants for being here today. But I know time is precious, so without further ado, I'm going to start. Do you see my screen right now? Yeah, excellent. So wait a minute. I'm sorry. Yes. So in my presentation today, I will try to focus on a few elements. The work around anticipatory action is very new to MSF. So I'm going to go to say, maybe clarify some of the definitions, what we mean as MSF by anticipatory action. I will try to focus on some of the key elements of our work, the key aspects that we started as we delved into that issue. And then I will try to focus, which is I think the most important, of some of the preliminary takeaway messages that we have extracted from our work so far. Right? So I will start right away with the definitions. And because it's important when we talk in the humanitarian sector that we share the same vocabulary and we know each other what exactly we say when we talk about an issue. So we know that the definitions are around the humanitarian anticipatory action. They are different, but they all have a common understanding and some similar concepts. And for MSF, this is no different. But before we did that, we thought that it is important for us to define what is planetary health, because this is the context within which we placed anticipatory action. So for MSF, from a medical perspective, planetary health refers to the health problems in human populations that they arise from the interactions between humans, animals, and the environment through what we call an ecosystem perspective, but taking the human actions playing a central role. And following that, we were able to define what is anticipatory action. So our terminology basically means that is emergency preparedness and response, but with a caveat that It involves utilizing data and forecasting tools, both internal and external, in order to facilitate the decision-making process in first scenario assessment, planning priorities, strategic planning, and the allocation of resources. So given the impact of the climate crisis on exacerbating the scale and the severity of emergency preparedness, we thought that prioritization would be very important, first by starting defining planetary health and then anticipatory action. So of course, the first thing we noticed as we started working was the introduction of the human element. So specifically looking back at our past experience and observations over the last year, we started, like most practitioners, like researchers like yourselves, affected communities, government agencies, we note down some significant trends. The first one we saw is that climate-related disasters are increasing worldwide. That's a thing. We look at back the last 50, 60 years, we see a trend that there's more and more people affected. So we see that with the increased human impact, the increased human footprint means more human development, and more human development means more disasters. Of course, that doesn't mean that humans cause the disasters by themselves directly, obviously, but more human presence means more exposure, and more exposure means more vulnerability. The second point that we extracted, it's something that is basic theory, there's nothing new, and it has to do with our own knowledge around emergencies and disaster management. We know that, for example, prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, these 5 parts, they're all parts of a comprehensive disaster management approach. As I said, there's nothing new here. But what is noticeable at the practical level, at the emergency level, where we have to respond, is that most disaster-related deaths and injury, they take place during impact. And 80% of these deaths, they happen just before the responders arrive. So that means that we have to acknowledge that the significant burden could be dramatically reduced if we focus in the pre-impact areas of prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. And that's where the human element is dominant. So with that in mind, we started questioning in MSF a few things. We started questioning what challenges are we facing? What are the lessons learned, and how we are getting prepared to move forward? So don't be confused by the complicated slides. It's a process that started with us when we try to put also things in order. And it has certainly been a challenge for our work to try to connect together our strategic ambitions and establish strong connections with the needs of field operations and affected communities. And while the initial focus on our work was anticipating extreme weather events, we realized early on how important it is to have a systematic understanding of how weather and climate have a secondary impact on different other events. So in that line, we saw that anticipatory action affected our work on, for example, internal migration, on forced displacement, on disease outbreaks like malaria, meningitis, cholera, measles, and later on, of course, as we saw with COVID-19, we saw that it affects also on non-communicable diseases like asthma, for example, and in other areas like food security and nutrition. So as a way to going forward, we started creating with local communities seasonal emergency calendars and catalogs of user-friendly anticipatory tools. We started with a simple Excel sheet where we could make it available on several platforms, and that would give the opportunity to further assist the field anticipatory toolkits for the local communities and teams on the ground. So the next question was how we would proceed to mitigate, and we identify that what you can measure, you can mitigate. This is very important. So we started reviewing how assistance is delivered on the field to ensure that we can continue to respond to the increasing crisis. There was a process that started around 2019 where MSF launched an environmental impact toolkit. And that toolkit, they provided the supportive framework through which MSF medical programs, our field operations, but also our own offices, they could measure in specific areas, they could measure specific indicators. We started measuring carbon emissions, waste production, supply chain KPIs, byproducts, and other like physical phenomena like heat wave patterns of co-production, and so on. And we use this to offer advice on mitigation activities on policies and behavioral changes that we could pass on to the local communities. So the result of these measurements are already informing right now our target setting, our strategic planning, and emergency transition in investment, but not only in the local communities, but also within our organization, specifically take into account that, as you can see, a lot of the environmental impact toolkit and these exercises started with a lot of our in-house or home locations. So we did that in the field in Kenya, in Mexico. We did in our headquarters in Geneva, for example, and some other major partner sections. And we are hoping to roll out this one. They're going to be rolled out more closely also to the region. So another concrete important lessons that we received was the following. So by 2020, when we look back at the hurricanes, we look back at cyclones, we noticed that hundreds of healthcare centers that were damaged and completely destroyed. Millions of people, we saw that they were left with limited or no access to healthcare because there were not available hospitals, there were not available centers. And looking back also, we realized that even before the effect of this extreme weather, the health system in many countries had been under considerable strain. So we saw, for example, that a lot of the hospitals, even before, they were struggling to accommodate COVID-19 patients. They were struggling to accommodate patients with dengue, or patients, for example, that they suffered from outbreaks that they were driven by insecticide-resistant mosquitoes. So in many cases where MSF responded, we tried to address the needs of health systems that they were already into the limits. And that we saw in our own region. We saw that in Palu, we saw that in Pandang, we saw that in Luzon, or Luzon, if I pronounce it properly. But also beyond that, we saw that in Haiti, in Honduras, we saw that in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, and many other locations. So we know that without significant action to tackle the climate change, such scenarios will become more common. They will become more and more health systems will be squeezed by the connecting and compounding the health and climate crisis. So we know at this point that climate change is only one of the multiple factors that contribute to this negative effect. Weak infrastructure, mismanagement, and lack of surveillance are also compounded to compromise the ability of the healthcare system. So at this point, the medical diagnosis for MSF is undisputable. We know that planetary health, the context within which we placed anticipatory action, is very important. So we know that a climate emergency is at hand, where the consequences for all of us, for the environment, for the humanity, they are worsening every day. So by looking at framing the humanitarian crisis through a planetary health lens, we aim to address issues of climate change, to address issues of degradation, and so on. And we know at this point that while mitigation and more environmental friendly practices are important first steps, adaptation of NGOs, government agencies, and other in the private sector, for example, they remain the critical point. So we argue that, for example, case studies, in-depth desk reviews, operational research, and so on, they all need to be, and of course, development of new predictive analytics should be some of the concrete actions and tools that they have to be carried out by all sectors to analyze the planetary health thematic, which will help us to be better poised within the anticipatory action. So it is also important at this stage to make the connections, to connect the dots between other important aspects in that area. And we think, for example, that adaptation and mitigation are the two sides of the same coin. So we are witnessing right now the consequences of what's called the Great Collision of humanity and other parts of the natural environment. And we know, and this is a very critical point that has to be added in our understanding, that human-made factors, like, for example, weak infrastructure, poor governance, corruption, poverty, inequality, there are all aspects that are exacerbating our vulnerability when it comes to climate-related hazards and other health and climate-related tragedies. So looking back at our 50 years history, a pattern emerges, one that has become increasingly clear. Many of the places that we consider the most vulnerable are the places that they are affected the most. They are going through one crisis to the other without the time to recover. And also it's important to note that these are the places that they are contributing the least to the root causes of the anthropogenic climate change. So at this point, I think it's very important to say what are the key messages, the quick key messages, the takeaway lessons, the lessons learned in our, as I said, this is a very new work for MSF. So we're starting to collecting the points, and we think we have extracted some of us that can be the starting point for our work, for the work to move forward. So the first one is very obvious that the climate change is interacting with other global health threats to create this, and they create this connected, compounding, and cascading crisis. So we know, as I said earlier, that we know that in many of the places we work, we are observing an accelerating pattern where one emergency is closely followed by another one and gives very limited space to the communities in between to recover. The second important point has to do that since this crisis stretch the capacity of the local and international humanitarian responders, it is very important to have a coordinated, holistic, and intersectoral approach or response in order to mitigate these interconnected global threats. From moving on, also the third point is that we know that humanitarian needs already outstrip the capacity of governments and global humanitarian actors. So what is needed before at this stage is to increase the investment that is required to build up our climate resilient responses. The fourth important point is that governments should not retreat from multilateralism. Sometimes we see that there's obligations under international and national law, they are stretched. And it's very important that governments and all actors, they should bring together, they should come together and they should resort back to the idea of multilateralism. The fifth point is that we need to maximize the efficiency and effectiveness of responses in order to be able to assimilate and include in our planning, to include hazard mapping, epidemiological and meteorological forecasting tools. And that's something that many NGOs can start to do. And not only this, leave this to the governments and the private sector. The sixth point is, for example, that emergency management experience and the technical capacity of many international humanitarian organizations like MSF could be leveraged to increase their robust responses to the climate disaster-prone areas. The seventh message we think we have gathered and we want to work on is to acknowledge that humanitarian work actors, health actors, private actors, and so on, they should all step up and try to significantly reduce their own negative impact on the environment. And last but not least, I believe, most importantly, I would say, that is very important for the humanitarian responders to build trust and collaborate with the communities and local actors, and those who are more experts so far, they have become experts in responding to the challenges they face. We do that, we stirred up, as I said before I conclude, I know my time is almost up. This is a very new work for MSF, which started 3-4 years ago, and the work around COVID also has accelerated our understanding. We placed it within the context of planetary health. We think that it is important for all of us to come together. And I think since it's a new work, we have started publishing, and we start sharing some, presenting and developing some articles and publications. We started a few years ago with the Lancet, and I'm very happy to share with any of you, anybody who wants to share and see more clearly later on with specific field examples, our work. And with that note, I will end here. I will stop sharing, and thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, Costa. Fascinating presentation there. We've currently got a project going on planetary health. So I think there are a lot of key takeaways for us in our own work there, as well as hearing how MSF are adapting to the new challenges that we face in terms of the interconnection between climate and health threats. I would like now to turn to Matilda Leon from World Vision International. Matilda, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. Can you see my slides? Yeah, okay, so I'm Matilda from World Vision Singapore. Thank you very much for having me here today to share more about how COVID-19 has changed the way World Vision works. So for those of you who are not familiar with World Vision, we are one of the world's largest international children's charity. We operate in nearly 100 countries worldwide. So we serve the most vulnerable children and their communities, regardless of religion, race, ethnicity, and gender. And our work is really primarily focused on three main areas: promoting transformational and holistic development, disaster response, as well as advocacy building. So if you look at COVID-19 in particular, our scale of work has enabled us to reach about 75 million people, including 33 million children across more than 70 countries since the COVID pandemic began. However, this journey of COVID-19 response has been one of constant learning and adaptation. And we hope that the experience that we have garnered and will share here today will be useful for everyone as we to see how we can better approach disaster management and response. So just a bit of background. One of the key areas that we as an international humanitarian organization particularly took pride in pre-COVID was our vast capabilities and processes in place for disaster response work. So as a World Vision partnership, all our local field officers are trained in disaster response, which enables us to be on the ground within 24 to 72 hours after a disaster strikes to support and provide immediate aid. So this is the field officers are also supported by a global search capacity of more than 600 international disaster experts around the world who can be deployed within a few hours of the disaster. We also have pre-positioned relief supplies in warehouses across the world, which is ready for up to 225,000 beneficiaries at any time. So with this level of preparation, you can imagine that the COVID-19 pandemic really took us by surprise. Almost overnight, all our well-established processes and systems broke down, with our international search capacity grounded and unable to fly. Logistics supply chains were also disrupted, and suddenly one country after another was announcing lockdown restrictions, which further hindered access to the most vulnerable communities. So the greatest challenge for us then was how can we innovate and implement a response virtually and digitally when face-to-face high engagement became high risk, and in some instances, even unlawful for our staff and communities. However, this challenge also became for us an opportunity to witness that transformative power of local capacity building, which we had embedded in our long-term development work. So for World Vision, we typically stay in a community for 10 to 15 years to ensure sustainability. So this had enabled us to create community groups and form essential partnerships to promote self-reliance. And during COVID-19, when our staff strength and physical presence was affected, these community groups and partnerships then became for us our hands and feet to continue advocating for change and ensuring that the needs of the most vulnerable remain met, while we as staff provided remote support. So for example, if you look at the photo on the slide, this is a photo of the children's club that World Vision established in India. So when the second wave of COVID-19 hit the country with vengeance, when even most of our staff were personally affected, the children's group in Nala, India, took it upon themselves to raise awareness about COVID-19 vaccination among their own community. So with the support of World Vision, they made banners and went about dispelling falsehoods and tried persuading their parents and friends to be vaccinated. So to us, this shows the importance of local capacity building and the impact that communities themselves, even children, can make. So a second challenge for us was also that the scale of the pandemic meant that we had to rapidly adapt our programming and footprint in response to the shifting patterns of vulnerability and lockdown. So we gradually had to adapt our plans in response to the prevailing and urgent needs. And in the first half of 2020 alone, we amended our response plan 4 times. First, we began with a response in China only, before scaling up to Asia Pacific, and then 17 countries worldwide, before finally addressing more than 70 countries worldwide. So this progressive expansion allowed us to prioritize the most vulnerable communities and countries accordingly. Additionally, to ensure accountability and partnership across the and mutual learning across the partnership, we also introduced a centralized dashboard to capture key impact indicators and activities. Good approaches and initiatives across the partnership were also disseminated and shared via monthly impact reports. And the third and last significant challenge for us was that COVID-19 required us to respond to needs that far outstrip the implementation capacity of any one government, organization, or community. So, but yet at the same time, the pandemic brought about opportunities that we had never before considered. So while we had corporates like ANZ who partnered with us to multiply their impact through employee matching, we also, for the first time, was able to partner with NGOs even from a support perspective. So for example, when COVID-19 first hit China, World Vision became one of the implementing partners of the Singapore Red Cross, enabling us to reach nearly 120,000 people, including providing hospitals in Wuhan, Ground Zero itself, with much needed emergency medical equipment. So the question going forward then is that based on these experiences and learnings of COVID-19, how can we scale anticipatory action going forward? This is particularly important as COVID-19 aside. Climate change, as our first speaker Costa has mentioned, it will and already is affecting our work, where you have global hunger crises ongoing. So how can we extract the lessons that we have learned from COVID-19 to scale anticipatory efforts? And the key for us, for World Vision, this lies in pre-positioning. So most people associate pre-positioning with goods. And during a disaster, we know that emergency relief supplies are always needed and wanted. The question then becomes, rather than requesting for goods in kind or what some people call unsolicited bilateral donations, UBDs, how only during a disaster, are there opportunities to have partnerships for pre-positioned supplies ready to be dispersed at a moment's notice in the various countries that we work in? This can include commonly used items such as hygiene kits, or even the equipment needed for the establishment of child-friendly space like pencils, crayons, toys, to help children maintain some degree of normalcy during a disaster or a crisis. Additionally, beyond pre-positioning of goods, it also takes a vast amount of efforts for these goods to actually get into the hands of the communities. As such, is there a potential to also scale beyond pre-positioned goods to look into pre-positioning relationships? So what do I mean? For example, if you own a warehouse or you are a transport or a shipping company, or even if you are an individual who's willing to cover such expenses, is there a potential for us to form memorandum of understandings or MOUs to ensure that when a disaster strikes, help is immediately available for us to move the goods along the supply chain to ensure that it reaches where it is most needed when it is needed? Additionally, pre-positioned goods, services, and relationships are only as valuable as they are able to be used and if they reach the people who actually need them. So it's it's really the best if the communities themselves are resilient themselves so that they are able to tackle disaster response work with minimal support required by external parties, as was the case when our children's clubs in India was able to champion COVID-19 vaccination. As such, what World Vision proposes is that we should also not only focus on pre-positioning goods and relationships, but the last but not least focus area is on the last mile distribution by pre-positioning local capacity. So this includes providing hardware like evacuation shelters or software like early warning systems and disaster preparedness trainings even before the disaster strikes. Even climate change adaptation initiatives like environmental protection awareness, organic farming, solar, clean energy, such initiatives will also be good in this age of Anthropocene where you see the devastating effects of climate change on the most vulnerable communities. And not just building resilience before disasters, but also looking into how we can embed it as part of disaster recovery. So can we build better homes, flood resilient schools, Or can we even go beyond and equip families with microfinance so they can improve their livelihoods and increase their household assets so as to strengthen their capacity to respond even before a disaster strikes? So we had a lot of instances in COVID-19 where our microfinancing beneficiaries, when they set up a business, they were able to employ their own community members to work in their shops to earn an income, which helped the entire community on a whole develop and increase their resilience against disasters. So can we include these and scale these efforts up? So all in all, what World Vision does is that we hope to pre-position goods, relationships, and local capacity across the entire disaster value chain. Not only when the disaster happens do we react, but we want to be able to pre-position items and to respond before, during, and after disasters. Let us grow resilience, provide relief, and facilitate recovery all at the same time. So how can you help? So World Vision is now building an entire disaster response ecosystem, and we invite all partners, existing and potential, who are keen to join us in pre-positioning for the next disaster. So if you are interested in pre-positioning goods, like for example, hygiene kits, kitchen kits, water purification tools, child-friendly space kits, anything at all, any goods that you think may be of value, or if you are interested in helping to pre-position relationships like warehousing, shipping, or transportation, or even local capacity, helping us to enhance disaster preparedness or fight climate change initiatives, or even microfinance for resilience, or if you can do 1, 2, 3, or all of the above, we invite you to connect with us to make a change and to save lives. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Matilda, for that really interesting framing of how we can look at transformational development in terms of making sure that there's a longer lasting change in the way we address these challenges. And I thought it was particularly interesting looking at your time frame. We often talk about 5 years, 10 years, and so on. So it was interesting to hear about World Vision using a 15-year time frame in how they engage with communities and then invest for the longer period and have a phasing out period as well within that relationship. So thank you. Now I would like to turn to Angelina from Mercy Relief Singapore. So Angelina, the floor is yours. You've about 15 minutes. Thank you.
Mercy Relief was established in 2003 in Singapore. We are, of course, a homegrown NGO and a licensed charity. We were set up to respond to natural and human disasters in Asia Pacific with a vision to champion compassion and care and a mission to be able to provide timely and effective aid when disasters strike. Just a quick look at our organization chart. We are governed by a board of directors from which an EXCO is formed. Basically, we have three main departments. One is corporate admin and finance, international program, the very heart of Mercy Relief, where it is headed by a senior manager with an assistant manager, executives, and of course, we have country representatives. The last department we have is corporate outreach and resources, which primarily looks at marketing, fundraising, and social media marketing for Mercy Relief. Now, going on to our local impact. Our work is not really attending to natural disasters outside of Singapore alone. We also do programs and projects locally. This is primarily to raise awareness of Mercy Relief and seek the kindness, compassion, and generosity of corporates and individuals. As you know, we are indeed very fortunate that we are spared of natural disasters here, and we still need to keep our fingers crossed. This is because we are seated very comfortably geographically with our neighboring countries sheltering us. So we do our part to help our neighbors and other Asia Pacific countries when disaster strikes. We constantly seek partners and stakeholders. We reach out and work with community groups and organizations, schools and the public, corporate partners, and of course, our government and ministries. Our outreach programs are talks, engage corporates in corporate social responsibility programs, and we will be reviving our Mercy Overseas Volunteer Expeditions, or MOVE as we have coined it, a program that has to be shelved because of COVID. A quick look at what we do locally. We've carried out COVID-19 support for hospitals and foreign dormitories. We have our signature fundraising event, which is the Ground Zero Race. And actually, this is an event that we have just launched, so you can also do your part and support us. A campaign that we have also just launched is to commemorate World Humanitarian Day. This is a social media campaign, and you can log in and show your support as well. The traditional event to round off the year is always our Gift of Giving campaign that runs from November to December. And one of the highlights of this campaign last year was the engagement of a group of home bakers who baked and sold their boxes of cakes with proceeds to Mercy Relief. But what was really nice about this campaign was that we were able to donate boxes of cakes to foreign workers' dormitories, and these cakes were donated by well-wishers. A quick look at our impact. From inception, we have attended to 26 countries, disbursed a total of $45.8 million in relief funding, carried out 87 disaster relief operations, 74 post-disaster projects, and we have impacted 2.7 million lives. We do pride ourselves in being able to deliver relief aid within 72 hours upon receiving appeals. These are the four phases of our disaster management cycle. It starts with response, then recovery, followed by mitigation, and finally preparedness. Our 5 focus areas in attending to call for a response, and they are water and sanitation, healthcare, shelter, sustainable livelihoods, and education. All these areas are critical in one way or another after disaster strikes. Areas that often leave the victims in want and despair, often having their lives turned upside down. So we strive to help them through to some normalcy in life. Here are some recent and ongoing efforts. The most recent will be our South Asia flood that hit Bangladesh and India in June this year. And just before that was Typhoon Rai in the Philippines. That was followed closely by Tropical Storm Meji at the beginning of the year. We have also rendered COVID-19 support to Nepal, Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. Our support does not stop at disaster relief. If funds permit, we carry on with post-disaster projects Again, all in an effort to take beneficiaries back to some normalcy in life. Some statistics of the COVID-19 aid and assistance that we have carried out, from providing oxygen concentrators, PPEs, hand washing stations, disinfection of evacuation sites, swab test booths and protective gear for workers, to hygiene kits, food items, and all these have benefited over 32,000 beneficiaries. In 2021, we had the Typhoon Rai. This was a super typhoon of sustained winds of 160 miles per hour. As you can see, it resulted in more than 400 fatalities, over 1,100 were injured, more than 2.1 million homes damaged, and more than 12 million lives affected. Our relief response, or two relief distributions of hygiene kits, dry food packs, and tents benefited more than 1,500 beneficiaries. Tropical Storm Meji hit earlier this year. It was a tropical storm of sustained winds of up to 49 miles per hour. It affected more than 2 million lives, damaged more than 11,000 homes, injuring more than 200 with more than 170 fatalities. Our three relief distributions of sleeping kits, dry food packs, and cooking pots and detergents benefited 6,850. South Asia floods hit in June of this year with over 39 inches of rainfall in a day. It took 400 lives, more than 50 went missing, more than 150,000 displaced, and more than 6 million lives were affected. At these two countries, our relief distribution of dry food packs, hygiene kits, and non-food items benefited 8,100. We're constantly planning projects for countries where disasters have struck and where beneficiaries are still in dire need for assistance. Our upcoming projects will be in Nepal, Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia. As you can see, water, sanitation, and hygiene still top the list, but we also carry out projects of psychosocial support, disaster preparedness, increasing resiliency of affected communities, and livelihood recovery. This is how we have operated pre-COVID and during COVID. We've always collaborated with local NGOs, and this has always been our standard of operations even before COVID struck. Because local NGOs are more knowledgeable to their local conditions and needs, and also because they're physically there. They can constantly monitor and update us of changing needs if need be. They can also help in various stages. As I mentioned, during normal times, we have always engaged the local NGOs so that we can better understand their strengths and weaknesses as well, if any. Now, back to the subject in question. Building network with local NGO. This is important and has long been our standard of operations, that we engage and work with local NGOs for disaster relief and post-disaster responses. They know the ground, the culture, sensitivities, and the needs of the people. And being local, response can be quick. Local representative or consultants and local reps are, well, these local reps are important. Again, understanding the needs and the people are critical. They can also assist us in monitoring our ground partners. So therefore, they are our eyes, our hands, and our feet, which can actually apply to our ground partners as well. We procure local, unless the need is for specific relief items that can only be available in Singapore, like water filtration or purification systems. We almost always buy local. This way, it helps to save on transportation. It eases logistics. It's also faster, and we are helping the local economy. And we are able to provide food and other items that will suit the local people. So I've come to the end of our presentation, a quick one. Hope it was able to provide you with some insight of what we do and what we have done. and what we are going and plan to do in the future. So needless to say, as a charity, we need constant support, not only from corporates, but from individuals. So moving forward, what we have done pre-COVID is pretty much already the plan that we had to carry out during COVID times. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation and sharing with us the work of Mercy Relief, particularly during COVID, and how that has been impacted over the past few years. We've now come to the end of the presentations, and I'll open up now for Q&A. What I thought I would do is I've got a couple of questions myself, so I will ask those to the panelists, and then I'll open up to the panelists and Prof. Meli to see if they've got any questions they want to ask one another for it. And then I will go into the Q&A function and have a look at the questions that are posed there. So hopefully that gives the participants time to input questions in the Q&A function. So first off, I think for me, it was really fascinating to see how all these presentations work together. And with Costa, you particularly mentioned a number of key messages at the end, which I think there were 7 of them. And looking at those, there seems to be adaptation or an evolution of the humanitarian system in how it works. But there's often a question over whether it's reform that we should be looking at of the humanitarian system, or something a bit deeper in terms of how the humanitarian system operates. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how the humanitarian system should look, given those key messages that you mentioned earlier. And then secondly, I wondered whether you are looking at particular target areas for developing your case studies and predictive analytics. Are there certain areas that are of particular interest to MSF? For Matilda here, I'm just wondering, you had mentioned in your presentation a number of the different phases, but you made a particular point about saying there was a need to build more resilient infrastructure. And often we see this happening in a piecemeal way across the world. In community levels, one community has it, another one doesn't. So I'm just wondering if you've seen in your experience or the experience of World Vision, whether there's been a more sustained or scaled up attempt to have resilient infrastructure across a number of communities or a number of localities beyond sort of the kind of pilot project or individual project level. And then lastly, just for Angelina, you mentioned the important role that local NGOs have in shaping the way Mercy Relief operates overseas. So I'm just wondering what role is it that they have in the decision-making for Mercy Relief? Is it one where they're data collecting, or do they have a more upstream role in deciding priorities for Mercy Relief? How does that look in your engagement for local organizations overseas? So maybe I can turn to Costa first.
Sure, thank you, Alistair. Okay, I'll try to remember. There were 2 questions. So first, let me say there were, I think the points that I presented, there were 8, and the 7th message, the 7th key message we have, right, is looking inwards. It's an introvert message. It says about ourselves, and it discusses about reforms within the humanitarian sector, within ourselves, to reform the way we operate, probably the way we think, and the way we want to deploy our programs. And it has to do from our way we do our logistics, as it was presented also by World Vision, like try to do more local, find local suppliers, use more local networks that probably also reduce our impact, our waste management, our waste output. That could be another one. So there are reforms in this, but at the same time, there is reforms in the wider of all the sectors who are working in this area. And I think it starts with the way governments think, and the governments do investments or prioritize investments. It has to do with the way the private sector also wants and engages in that area, or has introduced their work and what do they expect from the partners they're working with. So it's more a holistic approach of that requires these reforms from all actors that are involved in many areas. And I'm saying that because planetary health is an interdisciplinary area. And that means we have to look at all angles, we have to look at all approaches, and it has to start with ourselves first and then expand. So the second, I'm not sure, I lost track of the one.
I was just wondering if you had any particular
Yes.
target areas in terms of where you want to develop case studies. And
it's very true. Okay. Yes. Thank you very much for reminding me. So I said earlier that we started our environmental impact toolkit. Started with a few locations. It focused on Africa and Latin America and some of the European context. So we're looking to do that wider at the global perspective. And we are looking right now to develop our work we try to anticipate some of the key areas that might be important. We are trying to analyze in Indonesia, for example, in Philippines, in Laos. We want to see more places in the Caribbean, more places in Sub-Saharan Africa. So yes, and the aim is to be able to tackle almost, if not all, the areas that we work, and this is around 75 countries, 75 locations worldwide.
Great, thank you. Matilda, just the question on resilient infrastructure being more widely implemented.
Yeah, so I think one of the advantages of World Vision is really the fact that we do disaster response alongside transformational development. So both aspects of our work are very important and they go hand in hand. So for example, for Laos, for example, when World Vision responded to the floods in 2018, and then again in 2019 within that specific locality, we were thinking this cannot be. We cannot be responding to floods every single year. And then it became a question of how can we then build flood resilient infrastructure. So we started for the next 2 years, 2020, 2021, we looked into building a series of flood resilient schools. And now in 2022, we have come back again and said, you know what, this entire system needs to change. It's not just the flood resilience and etc. But let's look into setting up also food nutrition projects with the intention that potentially in the future, we can subsequently build an entire area program there with the intention of staying, as I mentioned, when we stay in a community is 10 to 15 years when we set up an area program. So this is the way we operate, where we start from a disaster and we see where can we help to support in terms of the infrastructure. And on top of that, is there potential to scale our work? Does the community need it? And if so, how and what? And as part of the area program and development work in that 15-year cycle, then all these resilient infrastructure systems, processes are then built into our operational plans, into our activities and our budgets. So for example, in the 15 years, we operate on a 5-year cycle each time. So every 5 years or even every year, we evaluate and prioritize according to the needs of the community. So it could be that in disaster-prone areas, we include as a priority these resilient infrastructure that needs to be built at specific points in time. And because we are there on a long-term basis, we are constantly looking and evaluating to see what is the additional work that is needed to build the resilience of the community, not just in infrastructure, but even in other aspects as well. It could be, for example, in preparedness trainings, or even evaluating in terms of climate change initiatives, like can we help them in organic farming, for example, or different types of initiatives like microfinance that really helps towards building the resilience of the community as a whole and the different aspects that are involved in it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Angelina, just on the role of local overseas organizations in decision-making for Mercy.
Yes, our engagement with local NGOs or our local ground partners, it's more of a partnership. So in terms of whether they are instrumental in decision making, well, we work together. They are helping us in terms of data collecting and needs assessment and also upstream decision making. And of course, firstly, on them being on the ground makes it easier, as they will understand locals better and then they understand the needs better too. With the information gathered, we will actually engage, the two parties will engage in a discussion, and then we'll decide together on what's appropriate for the affected communities. If need be, we may also provide additional input from the resources or technical expertise that we can engage or bring in from Singapore for post-disaster projects.
Great, thank you. Maybe I can turn to the panelists now, and Prof. Melly, if you have any questions to ask each other before I turn to the Q&A function. Prof. Melly?
No questions at the moment, Al. I think we have some questions on the chat board. Yeah.
Okay, we have one question here from Margaret in the Q&A. It is to Costa. Beyond advocacy, could you elaborate on the understanding of planetary health at MSF and how it influences your work? And at the practical level, in your view, how is planetary health different from existing understandings of climate change and the need to mitigate it? We've then got one for all panelists, and then I'll turn back to the panelists. Thanks to all speakers for their interesting presentations. How have your organizations worked towards greening your activities to reduce the negative impacts on the environment? Has there been any activity or method that has been particularly difficult to green, i.e. reducing carbon emissions due to the need for international travel? So first question is to Costa on planetary health, and the second one is to all panelists about how your organizations have been greening activities and difficulties you've faced. So Costa, I'll start with you because that's a direct question, and then I'll go to the other panelists.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, and thank you, Margaret, actually also for spelling my name. Like, I have a long name, and so you spelled it correctly, and I'm very surprised about this. So as I said earlier, planetary health for us, it's an interaction. Okay, it's an interaction between humans, animals, the environment, and so on. So okay, that's theory. But it's important to consider that that the health impact of the humans that they cause to Earth, it has other secondary effects on biodiversity, pollution, deforestation, mental health, and so on. So at the practical level, that means that, for example, we had to intervene in many areas. Like, for example, we noticed in specific locations the increase of asthma. We knew that asthma was created by, it was within the context of planetary health because it was something that was created by human activity. People moved to a location, they started organizing the local markets, the local economies. They didn't use a lot of energy-friendly sources because of the availability that was, and suddenly we saw a spike into the asthma that was in the population. So that was, we had to intervene in that area, and we had to address, for example, also other related respiratory diseases. So asthma, for example, is a major non-communicable disease. We saw the same, for example, in other locations that the human interaction, they increase they destroy they create some sort of biodiversity loss. They change the way they do crop production. That meant that some areas were deforested and there was some desertation in the areas. That increased the presence of mosquitoes, and the presence of mosquitoes brought some other communicable diseases. And that also meant that at a practical level, we have to interfere. And there we have a couple of good examples of how you have this interconnection between humans, human activity, and influencing the environment, and the way the flora and the fauna, and then comes back to the human and it presents itself with a number of diseases. And that's where we have to intervene. So that's what it is at the practical level. And I think, I think that's where we go through this transition when we go beyond the theory to the practical level, where we acknowledge that we are not only facing an interdisciplinary issue, which is planetary health, but this interdisciplinary issue has primary effects and secondary effects in all aspects of health. And all aspects of health have a very practical, a very tangible areas of response and areas of medical activities that we can offer.
And on the question of greening your response, have there been any examples or particular difficulties for MSF in?
Yes, we started both at office level and at the field level. For example, a lot of our hospitals that we are trying to support right now, they're working exclusively on solar energy. Or we try to find other kind of resources that we will use the wind and the sun to provide the power of our power-thirsty medical facilities. Another way we did it is we try to move from international supply chains to more localized supply chains. We did a huge exercise where we tried to identify local suppliers in many locations. We did this here in Asia. We did this in Africa. We did it in Latin America. And with these local supplies, we try to minimize the output, the energy, and all this that we spend when we try to, for example, from shipping from Europe, some drugs try to find local producers using generic drugs that they could be minimized completely the distance. Another way was to reduce our own travel costs. Now we know with COVID, the experience that gave us is that we can have several meetings and we can have several interventions online. So we for example, people like myself and others, we reduced by 50% our travel and our footprint. These are a couple of examples of how we try to intervene and to improve this one, and how we looked into our own as an organization, to our own agency, and we started also to using more like our different analytical tools that we did this. So I can have right now I can think of a few other examples, like for example, and I will finish with this, telemedicine. So in some areas we started to use this online approach with that minimize the movement of doctors to specific locations, also remote locations. And we use online filing, we use online archiving, we use medical tools, medical diagnostics tools. For example, in some headquarters in Europe, where we receive the files online from the patients on the field, we analyze them and we provide the diagnosis to the staff on the ground without having to have this human rotation and so on.
Okay, thank you. Angelina, maybe I can turn to you to see about Mercy Relief and greening your response and any challenges you face with that.
Well, partnering with NGOs, we need to travel less. And we travel less for monitoring and evaluation. And of course, we are turning to technology like WhatsApp. And there is this technology by Demuto, where they provide QR codes, and we can actually tag these QR codes onto relief kits or supplies, and we can track them from their origin to the final destination. And we will be able to know that they have all arrived complete, because the Demuto system is able to photograph the products or the carton when it leaves, and then again when it arrives. So we know everything has arrived to the final destination. So this is another technology that we can use, and it reduces carbon footprint. But most of all, we are able to reduce carbon footprint by traveling less and working with more NGOs. But in partnering NGOs, we also look at their past works and projects and collaborations with other NGOs. So we are really careful in selecting the correct NGO to work with.
Thank you. Matilda?
Okay, so actually this question is interesting because in 2020, when COVID-19 happened, we also did an overview of where does World Vision think the challenges will be going forward and what is the role that we would like to play in it. And climate change was one of the aspects that we considered would be one of the game changers going forward into the impact on our communities. And therefore, in 2020, we actually set up a dedicated Fight Climate Change Fund, where we will actively take on projects which help to fight climate change as part of our day-to-day work. So one of these includes, for example, a project called a Sustainable Value Chain for Abaca Farming. So abaca is a tree. It looks like a banana plant, but it's not. So it's a tree that actually has the potential to produce fibers which can replace plastics. So for example, it can produce things like biodegradable bags, slippers, hats, placemats, and it can also help to the plant itself the way it's farmed requires minimal disturbance of the natural vegetation in the area, and its roots also have water, increases the water holding capacity of the ground, which means that it reduces the impact of flooding. So this is an area, for example, of how we are actively taking on projects to actively try to fight climate change in it. And we train, and it also helps to improve the livelihood of the local community members as well, because we train them in not only sustainable livelihood, not only sustainable farming methods to grow the abaca plant for livelihoods, but we also train them to utilize the abaca waste products to create the secondary products like what I mentioned, the bags, etc., to increase their resilience in terms of financial gains. And aside from this, some of the initiatives that we have include also, for example, a project that we have upcoming. So as you know, in 2015, the Nepal earthquake caused serious impact across the country, and a lot of buildings were destroyed. And there was a series of rapid rebuilding. But the problem with it is that a lot of the infrastructure that was created subsequently, because of the technique that they used to build quickly, was not able to protect the children, especially in schools, from the elements. So what we are looking at now is a new project that involves turning plastics into polyfloss roofing to add additional insulation into the school buildings. So this is something that we are doing right now. We actively try to look into how we can green our development and humanitarian work, and try to see how we can incorporate such greening or climate change elements as part of our day-to-day activities and responses. Yeah.
Great, thank you. The next question we've got from our audience is if the panelists could share any experience you have in working with religious communities or its institutions in the disaster mitigation process. And given the significant number of religious communities, how do you see the need for a systematic collaboration with them, especially in building not only a resilient community in times of crisis that is characterized with cooperation and mutual support? So how do you work with religious communities and what does that collaboration look like? Maybe I can turn to Angelina first, then Matilda, and then Costa. Angelina?
Well, we provide assistance to those in need, regardless of their faith. And of course, in some countries and areas, they may be dominated by a certain faith, but that's not relevant consideration. Well, donors are diverse in supporting us. So the donations are given regardless of where disasters are. And to borrow a phrase from our national pledge, again, we provide assistance regardless of race, language, or religion. So we can respond to disasters anywhere. And with the increasing occurrence of disasters, we have to consciously focus our efforts in Asia Pacific, and especially our neighboring countries in ASEAN. So to answer the question of about religious groups, religious communities, no, we just provide assistance where assistance is required. But we do analyze the appeal before we respond. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Matilda?
So like Angelina said, World Vision is also, we abide by the International Charter, so we do reach out to anyone regardless of their religion. But one thing to note is that because World Vision is actually a Christian humanitarian organization, we do recognize the importance and influence of religious communities. And therefore, this is something that we do actively take into consideration when we go to different communities to work with. Our first thought is, where are the places of worships? Where are the religious institutions? Who are they? Can we cooperate with them? The reason for this is because a lot of communities that we work with, religion actually plays a very important role in influencing their behaviors and actions. So it's important for us to work alongside religious leaders. And this does not just mean the Christian leaders, but we work with religious leaders across all denominations. So for example, including the imams. And we do have structured programming approaches that involve working with such religious institutions So one example is the Channels of Hope initiative that came out very strongly in COVID-19 as well as the Ebola in Africa. So these religious settings, especially when they go for services, it's when they learn from their religious leader what are some behaviors to adopt, why not, how does it work with their religious belief or contradict, etc. So what we do is we work with the religious leaders, we train them, we talk to them, understand their concerns, and after that we provide training for trainers programs for them to then disseminate the teachings and learnings to their own community. One thing to note is that we do not try to convert, but we work with them to see how we can apply their own principles from the Quran, from the Bible, to the communities that we are working in for the context that we are working for. So this is, and it can be a multi-religious training. So for example, you can have a pastor training alongside an imam. We do not have it segregated, but we have it together. And this also helps to foster peace building and intercultural relations. So I would say for World Vision, religious partnerships are very important and a core part of our work, and it's something that we actively seek to do and strive to foster.
Okay, thank you. Costa?
Yeah, my response will be in line with the previous panelist. As a humanitarian medical organization, that proximity to the populations we work with is very important as we are on the ground. We also need to base our work on the humanitarian principles and humanitarian values, and this is working with people on the ground, regardless of ethnicity, of religion, and so on. And we acknowledge that religions, like all, as we try to work with local communities, that religion plays an important role in influencing the behaviors of people. We also know that religions connect people, and that means that they have a great network to reaching out to the wider population. And as working on the ground, working with local peoples, that also includes working with religious and communities.
Thank you. Okay, the next question from our audience is over the increasing likelihood of concurring or simultaneous disasters. What is your organization's strategy in prioritization, and what factors influence your decisions? We heard earlier in one of the presentations about communities going from crisis to crisis without enough time between them to recover. So how do your organizations prioritize or deal with simultaneous or concurring disasters in communities? I'll start with Matilda, and then Costa, then Angelina. Matilda?
So one of the advantages of being an international humanitarian organization is that we have different levels of support that can be provided. So what we have established is a system whereby we call Category 1, Category 2, and Category 3, where we gauge the severity of the disaster and at what level should assistance be coming in. So, for example, at Category 1, our field officers will say this is a small enough disaster and we have enough capacity and resources to manage it on our own. So if that's the case, like World Vision Philippines, for example, could then just do the response on their own without the involvement of World Vision Singapore as a support. But so some of the things we consider includes, for example, the scale of the disaster, the number of people affected, how many disasters have they already been having concurrently in the same time period or one after another. So these are some of the consideration sets that then eventually escalates one disaster from a Category 1 to a Category 2 or to a Category 3. So by and large, the way that when we allocate the disaster, it's also telling or signaling to the entire World Vision Partnership how severe is the need and how should you be involved, or what is your involvement needed. So usually when it's Category 3, for example, it's all hands on deck. Every office around the globe tries to provide immediate support. But then if it's a lower tier disaster, probably countries that are in nearer proximity. So then, for example, World Vision Singapore would be more willing to help those within the Asia context, whereas, for example, the Americas would help the Americas. So this is also based on proximity, but so it really varies in terms of how big the scale of the disaster is and what is our local capacity to respond, and is there a need. There is no point for us providing additional support when it's not needed and the help can be better allocated somewhere else. So that's how, as a partnership, we work together to prioritize and eventually see where should our resources be channeled towards.
Thank you. Costa?
Yes, thanks. So over the years, I mean, we have tried a couple of things to do that. The first one would be with the diversification and reallocation of resources. We have tried to create a structure that will allow us to place people and resources in different planned parts around the world. So we have created emergency coordination hubs, emergency hubs in Indonesia, in Kenya, in Dhaka, in Europe, in Mexico, and so on. So we will be able, if there's a simultaneous response in different locations, we will be able, this will be independently, we'll be able to see what the needs are, create some more sort of assessment and respond. At the same time, what we have done is we have coordinated and we have worked on a resource sharing agreement. That means that we will pull in one conceptual framework. We will put all our resources and we will see which, according to our assessment, after something happens, which location, which area, which thematic needs more resources, and we will be able to transfer from one location to the other, so that will be according to the needs on the ground. And these are two characteristic examples. Another one that we have done over the years is that we are trying to, in terms of our fundraising and activities, we are trying to be proactive, and we have a big portfolio, a big, I would say, lump sum that is resting and is waiting, is anticipating these disasters to happen at the same time. So we're ready with some specific, very specific short-term process to be able to release these funds immediately, and we don't have to, in most cases, to do an appeal, a fund appeal to address a need, but we know this money, these resources are already available, they are in one place, and we can immediately release them to address one or many crises at the same time.
Thank you. Angelina?
Yes, we do engage in the local communities because they have closer affiliation to the countries affected by the disasters. We are able to seek insights and context on the ground from the community and associations in Singapore. For example, the response in Nepal, since it was the first time we engaged in Nepal, we contacted the consulate here in Singapore and the Nepalese Association to get contacts in Nepal with regards to reaching out to local contacts for financial aid. When we attend to a disaster, we do carry out public fundraising. And yes, we will reach out to the respective communities and hope that they will be able to support and donate towards the fundraiser.
Okay, thank you. I think that answers the last question well as well there. So I'll just pose that question to the other two panelists before I wrap up. And if anyone has any concluding thoughts, please include that in your final reply to this question. And the question is about engaging migrant communities, associations in Singapore as a source of resources, finance, cultural knowledge, and volunteering. And how have your organizations collaborated with them? We've just heard from Mercy on the Nepal example, but perhaps Costa and Matilda, you've got your own examples you'd like to share, and any concluding thoughts?
Okay, so for World Vision Singapore, as I mentioned earlier, we are open to working with anyone and everyone who is willing to collaborate with us. So it doesn't matter where you're from or who you are. As long as you want to help, we welcome you to join us to see how we can work together, especially if it's your home country or home community that you want to work with. We welcome you to talk to us to see how we can work together to support your fellow countrymen. But one thing to note as well is that for World Vision, we have our local country officers, which are staffed with local people. So they are also equipped with like for example, India is staffed with Indian nationals, Philippines, but with Filipinos, etc. So they are very well versed in the local cultural context, and they know what are the needs on the ground. So in that sense, for us, we rely a lot on in terms of implementation, our local field officers are the ones that take charge. As a Singapore office, we do not really dictate in that sense. But what we can do is we can work alongside the migrant communities and associations to support the programs and initiatives that our country counterparts are working in.
Thank you. And Costa?
Okay, so for part of the MSF structure includes what we call the association members. Association members are people who would like to be affiliated to work or volunteer with MSF, or people who have worked in the past with MSF and they are not working anymore and they want to become involved, to continue to be involved and with the decisions influence the direction that the humanitarian organization takes. And we have a big association, a lot of peers and a big association group here in Singapore that includes people like me who are foreigners, people who are like here who are locals, people who are just transiting and they want to stay here. So we have a big, I myself, I'm a migrant, and that includes a lot of people like me and of our local colleagues. So in that sense, I would say that we are working with the people, I'm working with my friends here, the Singaporean friends, and we are working together, not only as part of the work per se, but as part of the discussions, the theoretical discussions that influence the direction of MSF. Beyond that, I would say that I'm not the right person maybe to ask for them, because I have a very small office here in Singapore. Our office is very regional. So, and we have not, so far as I know, we have not worked here in Singapore to some extent. We looked during COVID to assist some of the communities and some of the migrants in the country. We looked at that into the government, and we decided in the end that it was that we could be on standby in case we were called. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Angelina, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think my fellow learned panelists have given a lot of insight into it.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, with that, it just leaves me to thank the panelists for your insights. I think we see with the notion of anticipatory action that we're in a period of change in how organizations are adapting to the experience of COVID, and whether or not that is going to transform the way we work or whether it is a short-term change remains to be seen. So I think we've had some really good food for thought. So thank you to the panelists. And perhaps I'll just pass to Prof. Melly if she has any final thoughts. So thank you to the panelists for your presentations and insights. Prof. Melly?
Okay, thanks very much, Al, and my indeed my sincere thanks to Angelina, Matilda, and Costa for very, very interesting presentations. I just wanted to, as by way of closing, I just wanted to touch on what Costa has mentioned about planetary health, because we at RSIS, particularly the center, is really trying to explore that as a new framework. And I guess it fits in very well, if I could say that, with this whole agenda of anticipatory action, because it allows us to be mindful of all the interconnectedness that's taking place now, and that this interconnectedness definitely inform the way we approach things. I guess we are seeing that in various areas, whether it's in the context of preparedness for health. And I noticed now from this presentation that when it comes to preparedness in dealing with disasters. So, and I also like the idea that it's good for the humanitarian community to have the same vocabulary, to use the same vocabulary. As you've mentioned, I've always thought that when we talk about preparedness and response, you know, we all know what it means. But I guess in looking at now anticipatory preparedness, right, there are certain criteria or measures that we really want to put in. And this is where it loops back to the importance really of data, new data, current data, big data, small data, and data on the ground. So we face a world, particularly in light of, against COVID-19, a world of future more disruptions. And I guess the humanitarian community and the others, especially for us in the academic world and in the think tank world, really need to engage more with you, the humanitarians, and the rest, and also the policy community, in trying to come to a common agenda. And this thing that you flag about common language really helps us to look at common agenda. So you know, I guess moving forward, there's a lot of work to be done, more complex issues and challenges to be dealt with. And your role as part of the humanitarian community really becomes more crucial, given that you're really out there. For us, we just, you know, we facilitate discussion and we document, but it's learning from people like you that really helps us understand the current challenges that we now face. So thank you once again.
Okay, with that, I think we can close this session. So thank you to everyone who helped make it happen in the background. So Shin, Joey, Chris, and to all you, the participants who've allowed us to meet for a webinar at lunchtime. So hopefully you will still have time to go and eat. And with that, we thank you for joining us at the RSIS event, and we hope to see you again at our next event. So thanks very much. Have a good day.